Pam, you just want me to start, or do you want to say?
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay, we're just about there, I think. Okay, good evening, folks. Welcome to tonight's presentation by the Border Historical Society, a very special presentation by one of the most eminent American historians living today, Alan Taylor at the University of Virginia. And I want to express a special thanks to him for agreeing to talk to us, which was extremely generous. And I want to thank our member Pam Beveridge for being so bold as to ask Alan and actually landing the big fish, as it were. So, just terrific. I can't tell you how pleased I am at tonight's topic. And for those of you who don't know us, we're the Border Historical Society located in Eastport, Maine. We are a cross-border historical society. We'd love to have topics that span the U.S.-Canadian border, and luckily for us, Professor Taylor has written repeatedly about cross-border issues. I think we're going to have a lot of interesting things for both our Canadian and American folks watching tonight. The Border Society does ask that you your microphone, if possible, for you. If you have a question, how we usually proceed.
Okay, here it is. I don't know what they're talking about. So
is that we ask you to mute, and if you have questions, if you could insert that in the chat function, that would be great. Okay, so let's see. Pam, if you could mute everybody in the same place where you shared the hosting function.
Yep.
Okay. And at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to ask questions and please put them in the chat function. So the Border Historical Society, very active. We would love to have more members though. And for 10 Yankee dollars, you too can be a member of the prestigious Border Historical Society, and we'd love to have you on board. Our latest project is restoring a barracks building that dates to just after the War of 1812 here in Eastport, Maine. And exciting news, Stephen and Tabitha King are footing the bill for the current stage of reconstruction of that structure. And boy, are we happy about that. This brings us to our speaker tonight, Professor Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia, who's very kind to speak to us tonight. And I think the headline here is "Local Boy Makes Good." Alan is a Maine native, a graduate of Colby College, and received his PhD in American history from Brandeis University, just outside of Boston. He had a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Early American History and Culture in Williamsburg, Virginia. And since that time, he's taught at Boston University, the University of California at Davis, and now at the University of Virginia, where he holds the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair since 2014. He also has held a variety of honors from 2016 to 2017. He served as the Harmsworth Professor at Queen's College, Oxford University in England. And of course, Alan has published like mad. Alan writes books faster than I can read them. It's a very impressive list, starting with his book centered in Maine entitled Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, The Revolutionary Settlement on the Maine Frontier, 1760 to 1820, which came out in 1990. And most recently, American Republics, A Continental History of the United States, 1783 to 1850. These books have received very wide notice. Notably, his second book, William Cooperstown, won the Bancroft, Beveridge, and Pulitzer Prizes. That's a trifecta, we call it down here in New York. And The Internal Enemy won the Pulitzer Prize for American History and the Merle-Curti Prize for Social History, presented by the Organization of American Historians. American Colonies won the 2001 gold medal for nonfiction from the Commonwealth Club of California. The Divided Ground won the 2007 Society for Historians of the Early Republic, or SHEAR, book prize. And the Society of the Cincinnati has also awarded him a book prize for the Civil War of 1812. And the Empire State Prize History, which is a New York prize, also for the Civil War of 1812. He's won numerous teaching prizes. I'm sorry, I can't go on. He has a very impressive resume, but I've sort of had to shamelessly cut that down. Many achievements. And I'll finish off with that. In 2016, he won membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and more recently in 2020, received membership in the American Philosophical Society. And on that note, I hope you will all join me in welcoming Alan Taylor. And Professor Taylor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Josh, for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank you and Pam for helping to arrange this. And I'm grateful for the work that all the members of the Border Historical Society are doing to save the fort and to promote history education in that corner of the world. Here's an image I'm showing here of Passamaquoddy Bay and Eastport. This is from the late 1830s. I want you to enjoy it because there's going to be very limited content about Eastport in particular. It would be carrying codfish to Eastport for me to speak much about it, but you should be having Josh talk about it since he's become the great expert on that corner of the world. I'm going to talk more about the bigger picture, the continental wide picture. So trying to put Eastport and the border of Maine with New Brunswick in a larger context of the overall border with Canada and the United States, but also just to think about other borders, because I see them as all interacting in ways that shape one another. So here's an image of Halifax. And one of the reasons why the Eastport is a very vulnerable place in American hands during the War of 1812 is British naval might. And Halifax, which is represented here, image around the time of the American Revolution, was the principal naval station for the British fleet in North American waters. And so certainly there were privateers, American privateers and American warships that operated sometimes quite successfully in these waters, but overall it's a British naval predominance that gives them the strategic advantage there. So it meant that the War of 1812 in terms of American initiative is largely fought elsewhere. And the United States just doesn't invest significant resources to fight anywhere along the Bay of Fundy because they just know that they're not in a position to compete with the Royal Navy there. Now, the War of 1812, most Americans don't think much about. If you know, the books about the War of 1812 have titles or subtitles like Forgotten Conflict or A Neglected War or Not as Boring as You Might Think. Because Americans' books they go right past whatever War of 1812 book there might be. This is until Josh's book comes out. But right now it's they're between the American Revolution books and the Civil War books, and that's not going to work well for a book about the War of 1812. I tried to fool people by entitling a book The Civil War of 1812, but this may have just led to some more returns. But I want to make the case today that the War of 1812's quite a bit different from how most people think about it, and a lot more important. But when Americans do think about the War of 1812, it's for a few scattered episodes, like the victories of the US frigate, the Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, as represented here in this painting in a battle against a British frigate, the Guerriere, in 1812. So there's some memory of that. It's helped by the fact that the USS Constitution still exists. Or there's a memory that is revived every time the British Prime Minister visits Washington, D.C. There is some humor about the burning of the White House and the Capitol building. It's represented here in this particular image, with the White House on the left and the Capitol building shown on the right, in a much closer proximity than is in fact the case in Washington. Or there's a happier memory for Americans anyway, of the victory at Baltimore that came a month after the British captured Washington, D.C. And that involves at Baltimore. Could I just ask, if you have your microphone on, if you could silence it at this point? Thank you. Or there's a memory of the great battle at New Orleans in January of 1815, where Andrew Jackson succeeded in overwhelming a British force that was attacking there. So what these all have in common is they're episodes that show the United States on the defensive. Shows the British as the aggressors, and cast the war as Americans against the British, as if it were that neat. What it leaves out, in fact, is most of the war, which was fought in Canada. And here's a map just to situate you of what the situation looked like shortly before the War of 1812. You can see the United States, the states of the United States were entirely east of the Mississippi. Had acquired territory to the west of the Mississippi, known as Louisiana, which extended as far west as the Rocky Mountains. But the United States at that time did have possessions on the West Coast, with the exception of one fur trading post at Astoria. It is not an official government position. British North America is pretty robust in terms of the territory claimed, and it's a collection of different colonies that are not united in any way except through the British Crown. So you do have Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then you've got the two Canadas. You've got Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Now, when Americans usually look at this map, they say, well, there's some mistake because Upper Canada is below Lower Canada. But this is because our perspective is a very terrestrial one. Now, I suspect people familiar, excuse me, with Eastport are familiar with the concept of going down east, the notion that you're going downwind. Well, to get to Upper Canada, you're going upstream. So that's why it was called Upper Canada. Things moved by water. And that's why the Great Lakes are going to be a major theater of this war. The war for the United States is primarily fought around the Great Lakes. And the American version of the War of 1812, which I've been giving you, if there are Canadians listening, they've been very polite because they haven't butted in and said, well, what about the Battle of Queenston Heights or all the other battles that in fact were fought in Canada, and most of which were American defeats, such as the Battle of Queenston, which happened in the fall of 1812, very near Niagara Falls, just downstream from it. And it was a problem that the United States had, that they were trying to create a military almost overnight. They were sending raw recruits into combat without virtually any training. And it went very badly because they are going up against British regulars who are well-trained and supplemented by Native American warriors and by Canadian militia. And so the American invasion of Canada, which is tried repeatedly, doesn't get any sustained traction because of these defeats. And an observation was made just before we started this program by somebody that Josh, in writing about the War of 1812, was writing about an American war that they lost, which suggests that we do have Canadians on here. And in my experience, Canadians are remarkably polite, patient people, except for one issue, which is the War of 1812. And they just really want Americans to admit that we lost. And if you do, the Canadian will do anything for you. They'll wash your car, they'll mow your lawn. They just want that to be recognized. And I'm willing to do that. But I'm also going to argue now that the War of 1812 is a subset of a much bigger war, which I'll call the War of the 1810s. And in that much bigger war, which I'm going to argue began before 1812 and lasted well after it, into 1819. In that bigger war, the United States won. So Canadians get full credit for winning their part of the war, but their part of the war is it's a very important part, but still a part of a war that is continental wide. And that's what I want to talk about primarily today. Now, the War of 1812 involves Native people. So it's not simply Americans against the British, but involves many Native nations. We think that this is a representation of Tecumseh, who was Shawnee, lived on the American side of the border, and essentially in what is now Indiana, but was busily trying to create a pan-Indian confederation that included Native peoples in Canada, but throughout much of the United States, including down in Alabama, Tennessee. And this was one of the things that inspired Americans to embark on this war, was they were very upset about this attempt to organize Indian resistance to American expansion, and the fact that Tecumseh was encouraged in this by the British, and they're encouraged by this because the British thought of this as bolstering their defense of Canada against what they saw as potential American aggression. But from an American's perspective, this is a justification for war, because this seems to be a provocation, because the British are forming alliances with Native peoples who happen to be within the boundaries of the United States. Now, these Native peoples didn't think of themselves as American citizens or American subjects. They thought of themselves as independent people who belonged to their own nations, and they felt they were entirely within their own rights to negotiate with whoever they wanted to. But that's not how Americans saw it. And this is how Americans saw it. Here we have an image. It's a cartoon. It's a very propagandistic cartoon. It's produced to justify the American war effort. It shows the myth that the British were buying scalps from Indian peoples. So the man in the blue coat, who is on the bottom, is an American soldier, and he's being scalped by Indians, and then they are turning to this very portly British officer and receiving money in exchange. I just want to remind you, this did not, in fact, happen. And during the War of 1812 or any time in the run-up to the War of 1812. But it's something that Americans believe did happen. And it helped to motivate them to go into the, along with certain maritime issues that were also significant. But the United States is engaged in conflict with Native peoples, and they perceive other empires in North America, not just the British, but also the Spanish, who were occupying Florida at the time. They saw them as offering haven to Native peoples and also haven for escaped enslaved people. And this was particularly the case in Florida. So I want to argue today that there are a set of conflicts that we tend to think of as distinct, as separate. They include the American occupation of West Florida in 1810, effort to use covert forces to seize East Florida in 1812, something in 13, something known as the Patriot War. the attack on Tecumseh's and Tenskwatawa's village in Indiana at Tippecanoe in 1811, along with the War of 1812. And then events after the War of 1812, the attack on the so-called Negro Fort in 1816 in Florida, attacks on the Seminoles in 1818. They're all a package. And what holds them together is an American belief that their security is compromised as long as there is another empire near the United States, one that is capable of entering into alliances with Native peoples and capable of offering haven for enslaved people. And so in the story, Florida plays a very large role. So you probably thought you weren't going to hear much about Florida to talk about the Canadian-American borderland. But in order to put that borderland in perspective, you have to spend some time on Florida. And one of the prime reasons is this guy, Andrew Jackson. And for the time being, he's still on a $20 bill. Andrew Jackson is the great military genius of the Americans in this time, certainly very accomplished in war, but obviously a very controversial character as well. And in the run-up to the war, what was very important to him and other Southern men, white men, is to defend their way of life. And their way of life includes slavery. And for Andrew Jackson, who is a slaveholder on quite a large scale, he has a great hostility toward Native peoples and a great determination to, if he can, use this war, meaning the War of 1812, as an opportunity to seize Florida. Now, Florida is not part of the British Empire. It's part of the Spanish Empire. But Spain was allied with Britain in a war in Europe at the time against Napoleon. So they weren't in a position to say no to the British so much. Now, the Spanish they've not declared war on the United States. The United States has not declared war on Spain. But the perspective of somebody like Andrew Jackson and other leading Southern officials is that Spain is a weak pawn of the British, particularly in Florida. And so at the start of the war, Jackson wrote to the American governor of Louisiana and said, quote, "I hope the government will permit us to traverse the southern coast and aid in planting American eagles on the ramparts of Mobile, Pensacola, and St. Augustine." All of those were, this parenthetical comment, all of those were Spanish possessions at that time. "British influence must be destroyed, or we will have the whole southern tribe of Indians to fight and slave insurrections to quell in all the southern states." So the belief was that Florida is a place that could promote slave insurrections and assist Native peoples in attacking American frontier settlements in places like Georgia and Tennessee. And so for Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 is to be fought in Florida as well as in Canada. Now, Jackson's big opportunity comes when the Creek Indians of what is now Alabama rose in rebellion, not all the Creeks, but a big chunk of them. And Jackson leads forces from Tennessee and destroys their chief settlement, a place the Americans called Horseshoe Ben. And it's a mass slaughter, men, women, and children. It's the bloodiest battle of the larger War of 1812 is fought in Alabama, and it ends up being a very one-sided one. And in the wake of this battle, what Jackson does is he negotiates a peace treaty with the Creeks, and he extorts about 21 million acres of land from them. Most of the land was actually taken from Creeks who had supported the United States in the war. But they just happened to be in locations that Jackson and other American leaders very much wanted to have. And then after that victory, it's after that Jackson will first go and seize Spanish Pensacola, even though, again, Spain was not part of the war. He did this, he thought, to bolster American security. And then he went over and to New Orleans, defended against the British attack culminated in the Battle of January 1815. Now, a lot of people will tell you that this was a battle that was just a communication mistake because the war had ended, and that's not true. Yes, there had been a peace treaty that had been provisionally agreed to by diplomats at Ghent in Europe in December of 1814, Christmas Day. And so this battle was held a couple of weeks after that. Nobody knows peace treaty. And the other thing about peace treaties is they're not binding until they're ratified. And the United States had not ratified the Treaty of Ghent in January of 1815. And they're still fighting, not just in New Orleans, but on the high seas and elsewhere in January and even early February. So the war's not over when Jackson fights this battle. And so this battle is not, something just quaint or something about Jackson's future presidential political profile, which it, of course, in part it is. It's much more significant than that. I'm going to argue it's the most important battle of the War of 1812 for reasons that I'll get into shortly. Now, the Treaty of Ghent, I mentioned, happens in December of 1814. It took many months to negotiate this. And during those months, there's a lot of ebb and flow in the war. When it starts, the British are in a pretty strong position. They've occupied eastern Maine, including Eastport. They hold northern Michigan. They will seize the Sea Islands of Georgia. And it looks, and in August, they managed to, in a hit and run raid, get into Washington, D.C. and do a lot of destruction. Very embarrassing. The American government was, to be blunt, bankrupt financially and really didn't have prospects that it was going to be able to sustain the war much longer. British negotiators themselves weren't keen for the war to go on. They never wanted the war in the first place. They did want to punish the United States, though. And the chief way that they were hoping that they would get to keep Eastport and other islands in Passamaquoddy Bay and maybe have some other border adjustment in northern Maine. But the chief thing that they were really pushing for negotiations was to create an Indian buffer zone in much of the American Northwest. The Northwest at that time meant Michigan, Wisconsin, that area. But they found that the American negotiators, no matter how bleak their situation was militarily, would not budge on that. And this came as a surprise to British negotiators. They didn't know how determined Americans were to continue the process of dispossessing Native peoples. And they would not compromise their sovereignty one bit on that issue. So what the British negotiators ended up settling on, and they had to settle on it because the war starts to go a little more poorly for the British in the fall. Baltimore is a defeat for the British. Plattsburgh, New York, another defeat. And so the British, and then things in Europe aren't going all that great for the British either. They had defeated Napoleon, but the Allies in that struggle were not in agreement about the future of Europe. So there was a real danger that war was going to renew in Europe, and the British were in a vulnerable position with so many troops over in North America. They wanted to bring them back. So the British suddenly, in effect, caved in December of 1814 and said, okay, we'll just go back to the borders as they were, at the start of the war, with the exception of some boundary adjustments that we'll leave to a future commission, and that involves Eastport. But other than that, we're going to say, just go back to where we started. And we're not going to address these controversial issues that divided us, maritime issues in particular. We're just going to leave them out of the treaty because we can't agree on them. And then as far as the borderland, they folded on that. And they settled for one article called Article 9, which says that the United States is committed to restoring Native people to the position that they were in 1811. American negotiators are willing to go along with that because, as one of them observed, well, we can restore native peoples to where they were in 1811, and that doesn't stop us from taking lands from them a week later. So Article 9 is important to the British. They think they've done something for their Indian allies who helped them in the war, including the Creeks. But it turns out that Treaty of Ghent is, the meaning of it will be what the parties make of it after the fact. And the treaty will become, to be blunt, what Americans could get away with and what the British could live with. So I suspect that none of you except for Josh has spent any time reading the Treaty of Ghent, and nobody should read it and operate heavy machinery. But the Treaty of Ghent is actually really important. And it doesn't get the attention that it deserves, because the Treaty of Ghent helps to reshape North America, even though you read it literally and you think it doesn't do anything. Well, Article 9 is pretty important because the Americans will basically override it. This is one of the British negotiated there at the Treaty of Ghent, Henry Goldberg, who marveled at the American refusal to budge on issues involving Native Americans. Now, after the war, the Americans initially honor the Article 9. They literally, in that they don't ask for any new land concessions in the council meetings that they would have with Native tribes. This is one held in Wisconsin shortly after the War of 1812. You can see Native peoples are there attending, but there's a military presence of the Americans as well at this, and they will be making peace with one another. And the Americans say, we're not taking any more lands from you, but you have to accept that all the things that we took from you before 1811, which you previously denied, you're going to have to accept them or there'll be no peace. So this was not to the satisfaction of Native peoples, but they felt they had no choice because their British allies are out of the war. And then there are other measures that the United States takes. They ban British traders from crossing the border. And I just want to say the border, nobody knew quite where the border was. They kind of understood where it was, but there weren't customs offices. There wasn't anybody to patrol the border, really. It's people coming and going across the border pretty freely all the time, Native peoples and non-Native peoples. And British traders under the Jay Treaty of 1794 had the right to go and trade with Native peoples on the American side of the border. Well, the United States just abrogates that and says, no more British traders can come across, because they saw British traders as conduits of British political influence with Native peoples, and that was considered dangerous. The Americans also start building forts, in many new forts around the Great Lakes. And this is meant to make the border much more significant in terms of separating Native peoples on the American side from their British allies in Canada. All is very troubling to Native peoples. And so after the war, they go and they consult with British officers in Canada, and they're basically saying, look, we helped you in this last war. Now we're really being restricted in new ways. And an American official, this man, Lewis Cass, said, quote, this is the time to expel the British entirely from Indian country. But the British officers in Canada just say, no, we can't go to war again. They didn't have the authority to help Indian peoples. And their home government made it quite clear that they didn't want another war in North America. Well, why not? Well, Indians aren't all that important to the British Empire. They got all sorts of interests in all sorts of places around the globe, including India and especially in Europe. And war in North America is just not high on their agenda list. Second, the United States is the #1 import market for British manufactured goods. And the export of manufacturers is the biggest business the British are in. They don't want to lose that market. They lost it during the War of 1812. And the United States has started to industrialize and create textile factories, which was not in the British interest to have this competition. So they don't want this to happen again. So they want to keep that market open. And the third reason is they remember the Battle of New Orleans. They don't want to send troops deep into North America to tangle with the Americans again. If there's going to be a future war, they want to wage it on the high seas or maybe attack a few seaports, but not do anything more than that. And they don't want to do that, even that, if they can avoid it. So Native peoples will find out that no matter all the nice things the British might have said to them in negotiations in the past, they're not going to come and help them after the War of 1812. And this is also the case with the land that Jackson had extorted from the Creeks. And you can see the orange zone here. It's what he obtained in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, 1814. It's a kind of unusual strip of land here. It's mostly along the border with Florida, and that's by design. It's meant to isolate Native peoples from Florida, put a buffer zone of American settlers there. And under the Treaty of Ghent, you would think, and the American presidential administration of James Madison did think, that meant that the Creeks had to get their land back because they'd lost this land in 1814, which was during the war, and after 1811. But Jackson said, no, the war on the Creeks is not part of the War of 1812. It's a separate war. So this whole business of treating these different conflicts as different conflicts instead of all one big conflict, we can thank Andrew Jackson for that. Now, Jackson was so popular in the country that the Madison administration says, okay, we'll do it your way. Also, there were so many Americans that had poured in to settle on these lands that the Madison administration didn't want to be in the business of kicking American citizens off of new farms. So they decided it's kind of convenient that they can't budge Jackson on this issue. So we find then, during the years after the War of 1812, that the United States is turning what had looked to be a stalemated war into a pretty one-sided victory. One-sided victory not over Canada, but a one-sided victory over Native peoples and over the Spanish in Florida. And they will follow up on this. This is the Treaty of Fort Jackson. And you can see here that there was the demand to cut off all communication, to isolate. It's one of the features of that treaty. In 1816, American forces will go and attack a place that they call the Negro Fort, which is within Spanish Florida, but it was a place where escaped slaves from Georgia and elsewhere in the South had obtained British arms in a former British fort and were holding out. And the Americans went and bombarded it and blew it up, killing most of the defenders. Some of the defenders did escape and eventually made their way to the Bahamas, and others were cast back into slavery. So this is all done unilaterally by American forces, and then Jackson will do even more. In 1818, he will go deeper into Florida and attack Seminole towns. Seminoles were Native peoples related to the Creeks who were resisting American expansion. They're within Spanish Florida, but Jackson just insists that the Spanish are incapable of doing what Jackson wants to do with Seminoles, which is to destroy their towns. And so Jackson does it himself. And he kills executes a couple of British subjects that he captured, calling them British agents. They weren't agents of the British government. But as you can imagine, the British government's not happy about this. But again, they decide they wouldn't do anything about it because it's bad for business to have another war with the United States, especially if you're going to tangle with Andrew Jackson. What this all persuades Spain is that they can't defend Florida. So they might as well see if they could get something out of it by selling it to the United States and getting some boundary adjustments further to the west. And so in a peace treaty negotiated in 1819, the Spanish will give up Florida. And they will draw this line across the continent, the red line there, which is the new boundary line. So this then brings me then to my conclusion, which is to say this bigger war of the 1810s, which is fought all over the continent and is fought not just against the British, but against native peoples, has two very different dimensions to it in the final consequences. The North, what the Americans did after the war is harden the border. They made the border powerful and meaningful in new ways, primarily to separate Indians from their British allies. And what that does then, though, is it accepts that Americans aren't going to try to conquer Canada. Now, yes, there's a lot of bombast in future years. And yes, there are tensions over places like northern Maine in the so-called Aroostook War. What's remarkable to me is how this bombast, which you can find all over the newspapers and you can find in speeches in Congress, leads to nothing. Americans settle for this position that British presence in North America is unnatural, that it's doomed to collapse sometime. So what's the point of doing anything to push? Just wait. Well, we're still waiting from an American perspective if you wanted to conquer Canada, which I don't. But this then becomes the American position, enables them to cling to this anti-British perspective that British rule anywhere in North America is unnatural, but it means that Americans aren't in fact going to do anything. I mean, yeah, there'll be some local people that will try to make trouble along parts of the border, which they do in the late 1830s. And Maine people get quite agitated about New Brunswick loggers, and that leads to the so-called Aroostook War. But the only casualty in the Aroostook War is one guy who was shot by another drunken Mainer. In point of fact, the federal government does all it can to snuff this out as quickly as possible, just as they snuffed out various cross-border raids that were made around the Great Lakes during the 1830s. So the point of fact is that the War of 1812 does, in fact, harden this border, and it does mean that there never again will be any significant conflict between the United States and Canada. But it's the opposite result in the South around Florida. What the Americans do is they do their best to erase the border. They do all these forays across the border into Florida. They destabilize Florida so that the Spanish will give it up. And so this all has quite important consequences for the whole history of the United States going forward. That the United States will de facto accept the persistence of British North America, which will become Canada. But they target the South and the Southwest, the Spanish and then later the Mexicans, were a much weaker party for continued American expansion. And it will then push American settlement south and westward into places that will become contested among Americans over the future of slavery. And it means that instead of expanding northward into areas that would be clearly territory for settlement by free people, it pushes American settlement into places where it's going to be contested between whether it's going to be settlement largely by free people or also by people holding slaves. And so in many ways, the American Civil War is set up by what happens in the aftermath of the War of 1812. It's set up by the hardening of the border in Canada. and by the softening of the border into Florida, and then eventually other points further south and west. So I want to thank you, and I will welcome questions or thoughts that you have. And I'm assuming that Josh is going to field these and convey them to me, and I'll do my best to answer.
Well, nobody's written any questions in the chat function yet, but we'd love to have some of those questions.
My chat thing is showing two things up there. I haven't looked at them.
I think that's just about muting.
Okay.
But let me kick off with a question. So I get that the Indians are clearly the losers, and then there are enslaved Americans who certainly don't benefit as well from
Correct.
growth of an American empire. But I think one of the great unknown things about this Treaty of Ghent is this proviso that the Americans agree, although they don't do very much about it, to stop the international slave trade. And I believe that's the first time that the American federal government commits to stopping the international slave trade, other than, you know, certain limitations on the slave trade they'd had internally. But it's funny because they're ostensibly the U.S. government is turning off the tap from Africa, as it were, yet expanding the institution of slavery across the South and West at the same time. It's just remarkable how they can think about this one thing in two entirely different ways at the same time.
Well, what I would say is, you know, there's disagreement within the United States on these issues. But in Virginia, you know, in 1790, half of the enslaved people in the United States lived in the state of Virginia. Virginia and Maryland have what they perceive to be a surplus of enslaved people. And so they're quite keen, and they push very hard for the ban on the further importation of Africans, which becomes the law in 1808, which is the earliest that can be done under the federal Constitution. And it passes overwhelmingly in Congress. The only people who vote against it are from the Deep South, places like Georgia, South Carolina, which is where cotton cultivation is expanding. And so they wanted to keep importing Africans, but they're outvoted. Northerners are all against it, and it turns out the Upper South, especially Virginia, is quite against. Now, the people in the Deep South thought, well, the Virginians, they're doing this because they're in the business of selling their own slaves to us down here in Georgia and South Carolina, and their prices will go up if they succeed in getting rid of the competition of importing Africans. So it's not really a contradiction that the United States is, on the one hand, trying to stop the import of African slaves, while at the same time clinging to slavery within the United States. The United States is distinctive in the New World in its slave systems in that its slave population is growing the fastest through natural increase. So it turns out that in much of the United States, they don't need Africans, more Africans. Now down in Florida and Georgia and Alabama, would they like to continue to get Africans? Yes, and they did continue to smuggle some in, especially from Cuba. But they don't, on balance, the United States doesn't need to import more Africans in order to sustain slavery. So the number of slaves in the United States quadruples, it quintuples between 1790 and 1860, and it's almost all from natural increase. The United States doesn't do is ban the internal slave trade, the movement of enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia down to Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and on into Texas. Now, the United States pays lip service to trying to suppress the African slave trade, and they do some things, but they didn't want to cooperate with the British. And no matter what they say in the Treaty of Ghent, they don't really cooperate with the British Navy because it's just an issue of American sovereignty not to do that, not to allow British warships to stop American ships. Now, American ships did try to stop American ships. They engaged in the slave trade and had some success with that, but they didn't want British ships to do it. And it would have been much more effective, because the Royal Navy is so much bigger than the US Navy, if the United States had cooperated and allowed the British to stop and inspect American merchant ships. But that's one thing that American nationalism will not allow.
So we've got a whole bunch of other comments and questions, and we'll go through those one at a time, Alan, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Going back to that picture in Wisconsin with the American soldiers and the Native Americans, there's a question: were there Indian or Native American or First Nations women at that meeting as well?
There would be, yes. Now, they're not particularly represented in this painting, which is an American painting and is highlighting the chiefs who are in the front. But Native American women would attend these councils. It was very important to have a very large turnout, because Native American societies were highly consensual. There had to be opportunities for consent by very large groups, not just by selected leaders. This was frustrating to American officials who just wanted to keep costs down at these meetings, because Americans are footing the bill for the food and the alcohol and the presents at these things. So they would prefer to say, well, why don't you just send like 4 or 5 chiefs and we'll just negotiate a deal with them. And the natives would say, no, everybody's got to come. And they would come from far and wide, and they would expect to be treated generously. And so there would be a lot of women, a lot of children that would attend these councils, until American power becomes sufficient that American officials by the 1820s and 30s are in a position to say to Native peoples, you're not all welcome anymore to these meetings.
Okay, so Heidi asks, it's her recollection that in Washington, D.C., there's a building near the Library of Congress where the Treaty of Ghent was signed, and it was later owned by Frederick Douglass. Can you confirm that?
Well, I don't know if it's owned by Frederick Douglass. There is a Frederick Douglass house there, but I think it's distinct. I think the building that she's thinking of is the Octagon House, which was the place where it becomes the White House right after the burning of the White House. And that's also a historic site and a very interesting place to go. And so that's where the treaty, the final ratification of the treaty by the United States happened. The British had already ratified the treaty. And then the Senate has to approve it, and then the president has to finally approve it. So it's when the president signs it that a treaty becomes ratified. And that happened in the Octagon House, which is in Washington, D.C., and is a very interesting historic site to go to.
And was that the Richard Cutts house?
I
Madison's
can't recall who the owner was at that time. It very well may be.
Well, he was from Saco. So
yeah, and he's also married into the Madison family.
Yes, yeah, and his papers are at the University of Virginia, coincidentally. So, okay, next question, a good Canadian question for you this time, from Ben. Do the Loyalist population who moved to Canada following the American Revolution play any role in supporting the War of 1810 or 1812, hoping to reclaim honor or land?
The Loyalists, the former Loyalists, the descendants of Loyalists, because we're into a new generation when we get, the 1810s. So it's mostly the sons and daughters of the Loyalists who are involved in this. They tend to be quite trusted by British officials, and so they often are in pretty significant positions in New Brunswick and in Upper Canada. What clouds the pictures a bit is that over in Upper Canada, the largest number of the settlers there were people called late Loyalists. They moved in there during the 1790s and early 19th century. And very few of them had any legitimate claims that they'd done anything significant during the American Revolution to help the British. A lot of cases they were neutralists, or even some of them had actually been patriots at the time. But so they're the majority in Upper Canada. And it's Upper Canada is the main target of American forces during the war. And the thinking is that American forces could get in there and then the local people would rally to them because they were these rather apolitical late loyalists. But they didn't want to help the Americans either. And there were enough true loyalists in Upper Canada that they were very effective in cooperation with British regulars and First Nations peoples to resist the American invasion. So yes, loyalists played a very important role.
Good. So Steve and Rachel are hoping you could say a little bit about the Canadian-American borderland and how it shaped Maine. Anything you care to add about that?
Well, I will emphasize just how porous the border was. It's really only until the 20th, it's not until the 20th century that the border starts to harden in New England in ways that will restrict the movement of people. So there's a lot of movement back and forth. Pam mentioned this, and I bet many of people on here have ancestors that lived in New Brunswick and then they moved into the United States, so they lived in Nova Scotia. So there's a lot of movement from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick into New England, a lot of movement from Quebec into New England in the later 19th century. And there's no effort to restrict this. And indeed, their labor is quite valuable. Nova Scotia carpenters build a lot of Boston. And Quebec mill workers are essential to the shoe factories and the textile factories in Maine. There's a lot of trade back and forth across the border too. And as you well know, Josh, and a lot of it is just in any kind of customs restrictions. So I will say that this is that there's kind of a shared culture, particularly in the Border Historical Society, and the fact that it's the Border Historical Society, I think, recognizes this, that there's a common culture on the two sides of the St. Croix River, and a common culture between Down East Maine and Nova Scotia. And people conduct their lives in very similar ways. And they didn't want to shoot each other. They wanted to continue marrying one another and trading with one another. And so when I say the border's hardened, it's mostly hardened around the Great Lakes. It's not really hardened in any significant ways in the Maine, New Brunswick, or Quebec border as a result of the War of 1812.
That's sort of my take too, that the North Americans are good with each other, but the difference for Maine after the end of the War of 1812 is Mainers now hate the British. Not British North Americans, but proper British, and that's because of Dartmoor massacre and other things. Yeah. All those lovely big mansions that get built in Wiscasset and other ports were all built because of trade with Britain before the War of 1812. And the United States government intervenes very effectively after the War of 1812 to cut Maine off from British trade and encourage it to trade with the rest of the country instead. So let's go to a question by Professor Liam Reardon of the.
Oh, okay, Liam, how are you?
A great guy. So Liam says, thanks for a great talk. I would like to know more about British versus US attitudes towards Native American nations. Greg Dowd's article in the Journal of American History, perhaps in 2017, argues that the British imperial alternative for Indians wasn't really any better. What do you think? Take it away.
Okay, well, Greg has a much more negative view of the British than I do, but I don't want to, set up here and I don't want to set the position one side's good guys and the other guy's bad guys. The British Empire was very good at manipulating peoples in India or Ireland or North America in order to serve British imperial interests. That said, there's truly horrific things that the British did in India and in Ireland. You don't find things that horrific in Canada. Now, that's not to say that Canadian Native peoples were treated wonderfully, and when we look at the full array of it. And what's been revealed about residential schools in Canada shows that there's a very dark side, particularly in the 20th century. Now, is that Britain or is that Canada at that point? This is after Confederation and the formation of the Canadian Dominion. If we look at the period before the War of 1812, British population in Canada is so much smaller than the population of the United States. It means that the pressure on First Nations lands is significantly less than on the American side. That means that the British need Native Americans as military allies, which means that the British have to treat them more generously and more respectfully than the Americans tend to do. After the War of 1812, the British start encouraging mass migration into Canada, primarily from Scotland and Northern Ireland. And then they start in Upper Canada putting pressure on Native peoples to give up more of their lands. And the treatment of Native people starts to look a bit more like what went on in the United States, with the exception that in Canada, there's the development of a kind of, certainly a superiority complex toward Native peoples. But there isn't the hatred of Native peoples that develops in the United States. There's no equivalent in Canada of what Andrew Jackson did at Horseshoe Bend. There's nothing that is as bloody and destructive as Indian removal in the United States during the 1830s. Now, were Native peoples encouraged to move on to reserves? Yes. Did they lose most of their lands? Yes. But were there the kinds of massacres and at the point of the bayonet that happened in the United States? No. So I don't like, I want to be very careful. Let me just put it this way. I want to be very careful not to say British good guys, Americans bad guys, in terms of how they treated Native peoples. But I will say there's gradations, significant gradations of difference between the two. The end of the day, Native peoples get dispossessed in Canada almost to the same degree that they do in the United States, but it's done with much less bloodshed.
Yeah. A troubling and ongoing issue in both countries.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, Tammy Wells, thanks you. So it was very interesting, and she'd love to hear more sometime. Now we go to Gary Campbell, who's from New Brunswick. He's a Canadian, and he notes that the Ashburton-Webster Treaty included provisions for joint Royal Navy and U.S. Navy action against slavery as well, which I did not realize. Thank you for that, Gary. I'll have to look that one up. Robert Simpson writes, were immigration flows of Europeans across Maine's borders affected by the outcome of the war? My forebears came from Ireland, they were Scots, to New Brunswick into Aroostook in mid-1800s.
Yeah, a lot of people, this would be quite frustrating sometimes to the British. They were subsidizing immigration to Canada because they wanted to beef up Canada's population so that Canada would be better able to defend itself in a war. And they anticipated there would be another war with the United States, and they wanted to boost Canada's population for that reason. But a fair number of people took this British money and they came to Canada, and then they thought, actually wages are higher over in the United States. And so then they would move on down into the United States. Or there was a phenomena of people who would enlist in British regiments. They're Irish and they enlist in British regiments, and then they would get a free payment. They would be fully paid to go across the Atlantic, and then they desert and go to the United States. So there is a lot of that. Yeah, there are a lot of people who first land in North America in Quebec City or in Halifax, but within maybe a few months, in some cases a few years, they're going to be living in the United States.
Yeah, British deserters are interesting because towards the end of the War of 1812, they recruit a lot of French prisoners of war. So there was a Belgian cavalryman who ends up wearing a red coat in North America, and he deserts, and he founds a little town just outside of Ellsworth, and on his tombstone, it's written very proudly, "A soldier of the French Emperor," in the middle of the woods. You know?
Yeah.
So that those wars seem to create this tremendous motion. Tammy Wells says, "My dear Islander grandfather," that's Deer Island, New Brunswick, said no passport was ever required until World War II.
Yeah.
And I can believe that. I believe a certain pregnant Roosevelt was hustled over from Campobello to Eastport to make sure her son was born on U.S. soil, so that he could potentially become president of the United States someday. So these things happen.
Well, some years ago, I gave a talk at the Madawaska Historical Society on the Maine side, and my host, we went over to the Canadian side because the restaurants were better there. And there was just, at that time, this would have been in the late 1980s, there was just one guy sitting in a booth on the bridge, and he served for both the United States and the Canadian governments. It was the same guy. And he just saw my host and he recognized him, just waved us through. No showing of passports. I don't even know if I had my passport there because I didn't know we were going to go eat on the Canadian side. And my host told me that at that time there was the hospital where everybody in Madawaska was born was over on the Canadian side. And it meant that when they got to be, it was either 18 or 21, I forget which, they had to choose whether they wanted to stay Canadian or they become Americans. And they almost all decided American until the Vietnam War came along. And then a lot of them decided that in fact they were Canadian so that they wouldn't get drafted. So again, the border was much more porous between Maine and Canada in many ways, much more localized than it has been since 2001.
Yes, I had a big mutt, a big dog who used to think he'd like to swim across a lake into New Brunswick. And I'm literally grabbing him by the tail while he's paddling away trying to go to Canada. And I'm just imagining all the horrors I would go.
Fishermen on Lake Erie now have to have passports with them because they never quite know when they're going to be crossing into Canadian waters. And,
I don't know if you've heard about
waters, and they have to show passports.
Lobstermen this spring had to wear masks on their lobster boats because lobster boats were deemed transportation. Government. I, as a disclaimer, I do work for the United States government. It's a wonderful institution.
Right. Well,
my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay.
So we've got one last question, and then I think we should probably let you go, Alan. From the Gleasons in Bangor say, with my Canadian mother, I've been crossing back and forth all my life and never had a passport until the 1980s to go to Europe. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay. Does anybody else have any final last comments or questions for Alan? Well, gosh, it's been a terrific. He says there's one other question.
Okay.
Oh, I don't see it though. I thought we hit them all. Oh, so somebody asked what town near Ellsworth is that? I can't remember. I want to say it's Brooks or something like that.
Well, Brooks is not near Ellsworth. Brooks is over, closer to it's on the other Scott River.
Yeah, it's something similar to that, but of course, Brooks was a popular governor, so we got a lot of towns named.
Yeah.
Brooklyn, maybe.
No, I don't think so. But it's all right. I gave somebody my email, so they can answer that. Hey, that's beside the point. Alan, thank you so much. It was very generous of you to donate your time to this, and we're so delighted that you did this. and for just a fascinating talk. This was a great evening. And perhaps, next book, we'd love to host you again.
Well, thank you very
Learned a
much.
lot.
Well, thank you, Pam.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Lots of positive comments from both sides of the border, and so great stuff, Alan. Okay, folks, thank you for this presentation by the Border Historical Society. We hope you join us again next month, and of course, we do encourage you to join at a bargain rate of 10 Yankee dollars a year to join this fine society. On that note, have a good night. It's been a real pleasure.